What's going on, guys? Welcome back. And I know I'm a month behind making this video, but there's a heat wave going on in Ontario at the moment, which means I basically can't go outside without dying. So there's no better time for me to finally record my Mission Impossible ranking video. Mission Impossible: The Final Reckoning came out in theaters a month ago at this point, and I think I've got a pretty good idea of how I would rank the 8 Mission Impossible films we now have. Some of these are kind of interchangeable for me, but based on my own personal preference as well as the objective quality of the films, I think I've got a pretty solid list on my hands. So, without further ado, let's get started. At number 8, no surprises here, I have Mission Impossible 2. This is the one movie in this franchise that makes me sit back and ask, what the hell were they doing here? Because it feels like the creative team just miscalculated on every level. Even Hans Zimmer's score is bad. How is that possible? How can Hans Zimmer compose a bad score? This might be the only one in his entire career I can say that about. A lot of people have probably forgotten that there are high-class actors like Anthony Hopkins and Brendan Gleeson in this film, but they get nothing to do. Add to that a weird COVID-19 outbreak subplot with cringe acting and terrible dialogue with borderline sexist undertones, and you have what is easily the worst film in this entire series, to a point where The Final Reckoning, a movie obsessed with flashing back and reminding you of earlier films, tries to completely ignore the existence of this one. When that's the case, you know you've done something wrong. Moving on to number 7, I've got Mission Impossible 3. Now, I know this one has a bit of a cult following, but I've never gotten behind that. I find this movie to be incredibly forgettable. With that said, it's probably the most original movie that J.J. Abrams has ever directed. Let that sink in for a second. The one bright spot in it is probably Philip Seymour Hoffman, whose performance elevates what is otherwise a pretty one-note villain, and it does have more relevance to the rest of the series than the second film, thanks to later installments like Fallout or The Final Reckoning, but I can't really attribute that to this film, and instead the work of creators who stepped into the series later on down the line. On its own, this movie is fairly unremarkable. At number 6 is Mission Impossible, the first film in the series, which is a bit of a time capsule when reflecting on how much this series has changed from its spy thriller roots and evolved into this over-the-top action franchise. In that sense, it feels more comparable to the 60s TV show rather than the rest of these movies. The biggest action scene in it during the third act actually doesn't hold up that well, which is funny because the later installments in this series are far less believable, yet the action feels more grounded, if that makes sense, because the special effects in this movie have not aged very well at all. Despite having some tonal inconsistencies and dumbing down of the story content, it's still an enjoyable watch, and an interesting piece to look back on when assessing the quality of the overall series. Bringing us into the top 5 of the Mission Impossible series, I have the most recent and possibly last installment, The Final Reckoning. I've already reviewed this movie recently, so to avoid repeating myself, I'll simply say this. The more time I've had to reflect, the more disappointing this movie becomes. Not because it's bad or didn't meet my expectations, and rather because I feel like they could have done more. Character dynamics that could have been played around with. Storylines that could have been explored, which were left on the cutting room floor. It feels like they reverted back to the Mission Impossible 1 through 3 era at a few points, because They didn't know what they were doing. If you're looking for a grounded story, you aren't going to get it here. We've left those days behind. This is by far the most absurd film in the series, but I knew what I was getting into at this point, and they pulled out all the stops in the second half of this film. It's just too bad that the oppressively dour tone and egregious exposition scenes make it considerably harder to get through. The third act was by far the most entertaining experience I've had watching a film so far this year. It's just that it takes a while to get there. At number 4, I have Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning, aka Dead Reckoning Part 1, as it was originally known back in 2023. At one time, I was considering putting this at number 2 or 3 on the list, but this is one of the reasons why I'm glad I waited for the final film to be released, because what hurts this movie the most is that the final reckoning, the second part of the story, just isn't quite as good. Now, this film does suffer from some exposition and an extended runtime, like the final reckoning, but unlike that film, I feel the pacing is a bit stronger and there are enough fresh character dynamics to liven things up a bit. The script isn't great, but it has enough of an underlying thematic through line to keep me invested in the story. It didn't lose me at as many points as its successor did. And of course, the authentic spectacle of it all is as impressive as always. It's just a shame that the second part of the story didn't live up to what they set up here. If it had, maybe it would have remained at number 2 or 3 on the list, but as it stands, I can't place it any higher. Now, these next 2 films I could move on any day of the week, but at number 3, I have Mission Impossible Rogue Nation, which I'm surprised to have placed this high on the list because it was never one of my favorites of the series. One of my biggest criticisms of it in the past is that it very much feels like a setup movie, but on my most recent viewing of it, I gained a newfound appreciation for Rogue Nation, because although it does lay a lot of groundwork for Fallout, it still stands on its own quite well in spite of that. The script is a bit better than it usually is in these movies, and I think the character work is at its strongest here, especially with the bond between Benji and Ethan. It also has some of the best variety when it comes to the types of action sequences. Not only do we have an awesome car/motorcycle chase, but we've got an underwater espionage scene which very much feels like a precursor to the submarine sequence in the Final Reckoning, and even an attempted opera house assassination with flute guns. I mean, what more could you ask for? And my runner-up on this list is Mission Impossible Ghost Protocol. If you ask me, the film that saved the Mission Impossible franchise from falling into obscurity thanks to Brad Bird, the man responsible for animated classics like Ratatouille and The Iron Giant stepping into the realm of live action and bringing with him this spark of energy that's just kind of stuck with the series ever since. One of the best decisions that the Mission Impossible series ever made was bringing on Simon Pegg as a mainstay. Despite having a minor role in 3, Ghost Protocol solidified Benji as a titular character in this franchise, and the sharp wit of Simon Pegg brought this genuine humor to the series, which was just kind of lacking before this point. Jeremy Renner is kind of a forgotten gem, and Paula Patton is honestly one of the better additions to the MI team, who they just kind of forgot about, unfortunately. This film also has some of the most iconic moments from the series, from the Kremlin bombing or the Burj Khalifa sequence in Dubai. Where it falters is the glue holding it together. The script here isn't great, and if I'm being honest, Rogue Nation is probably the objectively better written film, but Ghost Protocol is the one I find myself revisiting the most. If I could isolate one movie in this franchise as being the most easily accessible, it's this one. Because later installments in the series, even my number one, rely on the context of prior films, and aside from one narrative payoff at the very end, Ghost Protocol stands on its own as a highly entertaining action movie. But coming in at number one, surprise, surprise, I have Mission Impossible Fallout. This was the first MI movie I ever saw, and even now, over half a decade later, it still remains the best. It has the most consistently storyboarded action and character work, the best pacing of the series despite being the longest film at the time of its release, and one of, if not, the best script in the franchise. Unlike basically every other movie in this series, there's no bloat or wasted time. There is a constant escalation in the scope of the action set pieces, which, despite straining credibility in the third act, still remain somewhat grounded in reality, unlike the two films preceding it. I've watched this film more than any other in the series, and I would gladly put it on at any time and get the same amount of enjoyment out of it. If you asked me whether or not I'd like to rewatch MI3, I'd actually have a hard time answering that question, but not when it comes to Fallout. This is the film that earned this series the title of Best Action Franchise of all time, because regardless of the many flaws that may plague the films prior to and preceding it, no one can deny that Fallout kicks ass. But that's pretty much it for my ranking of all 8 Mission Impossible movies that we currently have. If this is indeed the end of the Mission Impossible franchise, then I've certainly enjoyed talking about it on this channel with you guys, and let me know, how would you rank the Mission Impossible movies? I know this franchise is a little bit all over the place, and people have varying opinions on the quality of each film, so I can already tell there will be a lot of different rankings. Your mission, should you choose to accept it, is to please let me know all your thoughts in the comments below. And of course, as always, I hope you guys have a great day. Take care. Bye.